possible and they're able. Again, we've received assistance from outside agencies to assist us with these calls. Other community impacts include injuries, as we all know, to many. Not just to those that are involved in the protest, but to officers as well. I've already mentioned the fear and frustration in our community. And it also takes a huge toll on the well-being not only of our officers, but of community members as well. These costs, both tangible and intangible, are eroding the trust for which we are working so hard to establish and maintain between the community and the PPD. And this is the ultimate cost. So in closing, this new ordinance would not only provide for use of a proactive tool, but it allows us to get ahead of the issue before it starts. We were hired, we were brought forth to look at new, creative, innovative, and strategic ways of addressing an old problem. We've been doing the same thing and getting the same results. At what point do we look for new ways to come up with a different solution? I look forward to hearing the input from other stakeholders here today, and I really hope that we can move forward towards a resolution to solve this matter. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Chief. Colleagues, any questions for this panel? Commissioner Daly and Commissioner Fritz, then Commissioner Salzer.
I have a number of questions, but I'm going to hold most of them for once we hear from all the panels. So this question is for the City Attorney. What happened? Okay, I need to set this up. So when Patriot Prayer plans a rally in our city, they're pretty good at walking the line of avoiding speech that would trigger preemptive action. But we do see numerous members or followers of their organization making explicit threats of violence on social media. So it's my understanding that because it's not the organizers making those threats, that there's nothing that we can do in advance. Is that accurate?
That is an accurate statement, and what the case law also tells us is...
Can I just make a
Yes.
request? This has been brought to our attention by some folks with disabilities who testified before. When we have answers to questions, could you, everyone identify themselves again, just so that folks in the audience who may have disability know who's speaking?
Thank you for the reminder. It's Robert Taylor, Chief Deputy City Attorney. The answer to your question, Commissioner Daly, is that's correct. And the other thing that the other principle that emerges from the case law is just because you have folks that have demonstrated in the past and it has led to violence, you can't restrict their right to demonstrate again in the city. And San Francisco tried that a number of years ago in response to some mass demonstrations where they effectively prohibited demonstrations in the entire city and county of San Francisco. And the Ninth Circuit struck that down. So part of what this ordinance is trying to accomplish is to recognize and respect the First Amendment rights of demonstrators and counter-demonstrators, to let them come and exercise their rights, but to do so in a safe way that's safe for everybody.
Okay, so here's my real question. A right-wing extremist group is coming to our city to hold a rally. I'm organizing a counter-protest. This is hypothetical, of course. I've never engaged in violent protest, but a group that the city has decided has engaged in violent protest attaches themselves to my event or expresses an intention to show up. So is my protest shut down?
You're in Robert Taylor, Deputy City Attorney. In that example, your demonstration would not be shut down. What the police commissioner could do under this ordinance, if all three of those criteria are met, he could designate an area for demonstrators and an area for counter-demonstrators so that both groups can have their opportunity to demonstrate and counter-demonstrate each other.
Okay, so I shouldn't have said shut down, but my ability to hold my counter protest would be impacted by this ordinance if a group that I have no relationship to and had not invited as an organizer expresses an intent to do that?
If it meets that criteria, if that other group, that counter-demonstrating group that attaches itself to yours does that, then the police commissioner could, if those criteria are met, implement those reasonable time, place, manner regulations and ask that groups go to certain locations in the city.
So this illustrates one of my main concerns with this ordinance, which is I'm organizing a counter-protest. I want to be within sight and hearing of the people who I am protesting against. And if the city doesn't allow me to do that, then that impacts my constitutional rights, despite the fact that I am a peaceful protester. And that has a chilling effect on my right to free speech, assembly, and protest.
And if I might respond to that, again, this is Robert Taylor, Chief Deputy City Attorney. That's why in the ordinance we say that any redirection of the demonstrators and counter demonstrators has to be to a reasonably close location, and you have to have substantially the same access to your intended audience. And a good example of this has come up in the discussion around this, where in one of the previous demonstrations, there were demonstrators in one park, and then right across the street, counter demonstrators. And that was a very difficult and volatile situation. And trying to manage that situation the day of, the result was they had to close that park and move people to another park. And learning from that lesson, what this ordinance would allow the police commissioner to do, if we saw that coming again, would be to say, demonstrators can be in this park. The park in the middle will just be closed to everybody, the no protest zone, and then counter demonstrators can be in the other park. And so you would still be within sight and earshot of the other group that you're wishing to counter demonstrate, but we could plan for that in advance and let people know in advance where they're safe to go. And if we do that, and it's successful, the police won't have to try to manage it day of and try to close a park while there are people there. That's one of the goals, and I think one of the lessons that folks have tried to learn from these past demonstrations.
Okay, I understand. It's not a comforting answer, though. I mean, I certainly anticipate underhanded tactics by some of these groups where either they pose online as opposition, or they come and pose as opposition on the counter-protest side, and they either provoke this intervention beforehand, or they provoke the police. I'm gonna save the rest of my questions for later, but thank you for answering.
Commissioner Fritz.
Thank you, Mayor. And could I just ask that we don't do the clicking? I find it really distracting. Could you do, as was requested in the request at the beginning, to use hand signals rather than clicking? My questions, and I'll keep them brief because I do want to get to public testimony as soon as possible. Can demonstrators challenge the written orders like an appeal process?
There would not be an appeal process other than the police commissioner would issue the written orders with the written findings, and then if people believe that is an overreach or unreasonable, that could be challenged in court on an injunction. And that happens in other instances in other cities where they impose time, place, manner restrictions, for example. So that's a common way that these get challenged. And then the other way that they might be challenged is if there is a criminal prosecution that results.
Thank you for the answer. What's the thinking behind the 1-year sunset?
Again, it's Robert Taylor, Chief Deputy City Attorney. That was something that was requested by concerned stakeholders, and the idea is
Concerned
I believe,
stakeholders.
to give the tool a chance to see if it works. And if
There isn't anything magic about the year.
No, there's nothing magic about the year. I thought it would be good to put a specific date just so everybody knew what the rules were
Re-election
when it
time.
expired.
Well, I'm certainly pleased to see a sunset. Mayor, my last question is for you. We know that arrests that have been made in previous demonstrations have rarely resulted in prosecution. Have you had discussions with the district attorney regarding this proposal and how you and the district attorney would work together?
I have. Thank you for the question. I have had conversations with the district attorney about this specific proposal. The district attorney's primary objection, and I don't mean to speak for him, I think he's ready to speak for himself, was the inclusion of a specific penalty that has been withdrawn, that has been removed from the ordinance, in the substitute ordinance. He further stated that ultimately the constitutionality depends upon the strength of the written order. And he and I talked about the possibility of there being a back and forth and helping to ensure that the written order is drafted to his satisfaction, and he seemed open to that opportunity as well.
So you would show it to the district attorney as you're drafting it?
I think I'd be foolish not to.
Great, thank you.
So I had a question about what makes a permanent event exempt from this proposed ordinance? What is it about having a permit that somehow
Good question.
doesn't result in the same sort of scenarios that you've been seeing happen? Mr. Taylor, whoever.
Robert Taylor, Chief Deputy City Attorney. That's a good question, Commissioner Saltzman. So many cities rely exclusively on the permitting process to impose their time, place, manner regulations on demonstrations and counter demonstrations. And that can lead to a situation, for example, if one group gets a permit, they're okay. Counter demonstrators don't get a permit, the police might be in the position of having to break up that entire counter demonstration. And that's not something that Portland has historically done. And this would give the tools, however, to impose reasonable time, place, manner regulations for demonstrators and counter demonstrators, so everybody gets to exercise their First Amendment rights, but to do so in a way that is safe for participants and bystanders and the public.
But I thought the mayor said at the outset that this ordinance does not apply to permanent.
Correct. So,
that's
correct.
awesome.
Yes, so I'll give you an example where, again, it's Robert Taylor, Chief Deputy City Attorney. If we did have a situation where one group got a permit and there are counter demonstrators that have announced their intent to come and counter demonstrate, and those groups meet the criteria in this ordinance, those strict criteria in the ordinance, then the mayor could issue time, place, manner regulations governing that event. Both groups. And the permitted group,
Regardless of the permit.
correct. In the permitted group, it would probably be proceed under your permit.
They're exempted.
Counter demonstrators proceed in this manner. And we can then give the public advance notice so everybody knows where to go and demonstrate peacefully.
So having a permit does not exempt you potentially from the application of this proposed ordinance.
No, it does.
We would take the permit into account when issuing the reasonable time, place, manner regulations. So that in that instance I described where one group got a permit and another didn't, the written order from the police chief, or from the police commissioner, would make all the factual findings, say that this group got a permit, direct that group strictly follow their permit, and direct the other group to this location to peacefully demonstrate.
Very good, thank you, appreciate it. Next panel, I'm going to ask, and by the way, we have two more panels. One panel I would describe as generally supportive. We have another panel we wanted to make sure, even though I'm Commissioner Fish.
I'm just going off the run of show your office together. And I believe before the invited testimony, it was your intention to offer the substitute ordinance.
Let me do it afterwards, only because I know that some folks who are invited need to leave pretty soon. So let me put the substitute on the table after the invited testimony.
Okay, the only downside of that is that we may be limited in the feedback we get from our invited guests to what is actually on the table, and not everyone in the room is aware of what's in the substitute.
Very good. Carla, on the substitute, please call the roll, put the substitute ordinance on the table.
Mr. Mayor, I think you need a motion and then a second.
I move the substitute ordinance.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Please call the roll.
Daly?
To be clear, this does not signal my support for this ordinance. I'm voting aye for the sake of discussion.
Fritz?
Likewise, I may support amendments but have not decided to support the ordinance. Aye.
Fish?
Aye.
Saltzman?
Aye.
Wheeler?
Aye.